There we go. Okay. So I'm sure a lot of you, if you're on LinkedIn, may have seen Hugh's images come up. I see them getting liked and passed around often. And so that's how I first discovered Hugh's work. And it's really incredible to see that he has this strong focus on documenting artisanal and small scale mining. It's a big part of not just our jewelry industry, but our whole world that we don't often see. And so it's a really special opportunity to get some greater visibility into what artisanal mining actually is and the huge role it plays in sustaining our world and providing us with the products that we use all the time. And so until Hugh joins, I'm just going to go ahead and give you a little intro on his bio. And if we have to wait on him a few more minutes, we can just chat. So Hugh is a multiple best-selling author and Australian documentary photographer. His current major project is documenting the world's artisanal miners working in some of the most extreme and difficult working conditions. Hugh is driven to raising awareness about artisanal mining while also steering people to appreciate the many nuances characterizing it. And his hope is that in turn that will lead to better decision-making so as not to disenfranchise this large section of some of the world's most disadvantaged people. So the output of this documentary photography work over the years will be a major coffee table book and a series of exhibitions passing through the world's major cities, as well as a featured documentary film shot in 360 12K VR. So we'll definitely have to ask Hugh about that more. It sounds fascinating. And his dream is ultimately to establish a charitable trust to provide education and scholarships to children of artisanal mining communities around the world. So really the way this all came to be was I reached out to Hugh and he said, absolutely, let's do it. He's eager to share his experience and stories of artisanal miners from all around the world with anyone and everyone. So I look forward to him rejoining and hearing more from him soon once he gets reconnected.
How many of you are following Hugh on social media or on LinkedIn? He posts a lot on LinkedIn, a few of you.
We recently connected in LinkedIn.
Oh, good. I recommend just checking out what he has to say there. We'll learn more about his point of view and what he's experienced. The materials range, obviously, as you saw, the images that we were using to promote this particular interview or conversation with him are from really diverse parts of the world, the kind of extremes, and they don't all relate to jewelry materials directly. But even materials like sulfur and coal do factor into the jewelry industry in interesting ways. You know, for instance, coal being the majority energy supply for the country of India, where tons and tons and tons of jewelry is manufactured and materials move through there on a regular basis. So you might not think necessarily that coal is yours, but in this one, it makes it kind of evident in the ways that it is. Sulfur is another one where I was doing a little digging when I saw his images. Sorry, bad choice of words there, but was doing a little research on the impact of sulfur, which, you know, jewelers all know that if we're using silver, our products can tarnish really easily, really quickly. And sulfur is a major factor in that tarnish. And it's in the environment, but it's also in products in the way they're processed. So certain paper products are more likely to off-gas with sulfur and color your jewelry more rapidly. So craft papers, those they're brown in color, often tend to be more sulfur, rich in sulfur. So a lot of you have kind of, I'm sure, found ways to deal with delivering your jewelry to customers in ways that prevent it from being severely oxidized. But just wanted to show the way that Hugh's travels and sites that he's been at, even though some might not be directly jewelry related, they do affect us and the people that we are sourcing from. So it looks like Hugh is back.
Yeah.
He's back. It's not how I planned on doing this at all, but anyway, that's how things roll.
That's how things roll.
I'm sitting in the car beside the road in the middle of the Great Sandy Desert, so you get that.
Good.
Yeah. Thanks for rolling with it. So we were just we just did a little intro, and I shared your bio with the group. And a lot of us have been admiring your photos over LinkedIn and Instagram. So if there's anything else you want to share in terms of an introduction, we'd love to hear it. And otherwise, we have Christina set up with your slideshow, and we can start going through that as well.
Look, I'm happy to get into it, Maggie. It's yeah, happy to get into it.
Okay, I'm going to share the screen now.
Yeah, we're really glad to have you here, and
Yeah.
thanks for making it work.
And you can just tell me when to advance, okay?
Yeah, I will, Christina. I will for sure.
Great, thank you. This is a PDF version, so you'll be able to see a preview of what's coming on the left.
Fantastic. Can we go to full screen on that, Christina? Or
Let me
is it you?
try. I was having a hard time pulling that off with the PDF.
Let's have a look.
I think you can write hide sidebar, click hide sidebar.
There we go. Is that better?
Okay, fantastic. If we
Thank
could
you.
advance, to the next slide, please, Christina. And then to the next slide. Okay, so this presentation, you know, for there'll be some camera buffs out there, and this is not about f-stops and you know, shutter speeds and all of that today. I'm hoping that if we could go back to the last slide, please.
Okay.
I'm hoping that by the end of today, some people will learn something a bit, you know, about a group of people around the world that most people have never heard of. And I'm hoping that people can get a sense that the camera can be used as a mechanism for change as well. Back in, I think it was mid-2020, I was recognised by Ascent out of Canada for the work I've been doing in this field as one of the top 100 influencers. And I'm really, really passionate about this subject. You'll learn that today. And if you could advance to the next slide, please, Christina. So back in 2006, I had a client in Africa, in Australia, and they wanted me to go to Ghana to do some work for them, and asked if I would be interested. And at the time, I sort of ummed and ahed and was a bit sort of lukewarm on the idea, but eventually decided to go. And during the course of that really short 2-week trip, we saw a lot of artisanal miners, hundreds and hundreds beside the roadside, near a place called Estuary in Ghana. And I was fascinated. I asked my driver, Jono, who's since passed away, if he could pull over a few times so I could go and take some photos and look at these people. And he's a little bit horrified because the galamsey, as they're called in Ghana, didn't have a great reputation in terms of, you know, they could be difficult to deal with. Next, please, Christina. Next slide, please. No. So look. Can you hear me there, Christina?
It just did. So the image now is kind of a higher altitude shot of the mine site in Ghana. Would you like me to keep going?
No, it's okay. So can you hear me okay at your end?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. So during that trip, I saw all these galamsey mining beside the roadside, and I was fascinated. And then in 2008, I returned to West Africa again to do further work. And then in 2010, I did I think about a 4-month trip to West Africa. And at the back end of that trip, I was talking to a friend of mine in advertising back here in Perth, and I told him that I was interested in doing a book on the subject. I had no idea how I'd fund it. I knew that it would be difficult and expensive, and that was about the extent of it. Next slide, please, Christina. So at the back end of 2010, I decided to do a book on the subject, and you can see here, you can see the, so that project so far has taken me around the world. I've worked in about 30 different countries. I've worked across a huge range, a large range of artisanal commodities. Next slide, please, Christina. And then next slide, please. So this section, I want to sort of explore who artisanal miners are, of people that essentially worked with their hands and used minimal mechanization. So to me, these people, the vision that I have of them, you know, what I've seen of them, they're mining in much the same way as, you know, people did in the West Australian and Victorian goldfields back in the 1850s. So minimal machinery, virtually no machinery. Typically, they tend to work the higher grade ore bodies. So, and there's two categories of those, or two extents of those. You can have sort of large high grade ore bodies, and you can have the smaller high grade ore bodies. And typically, the artisanal miners will work both. Obviously, in the larger high grade ore bodies, you'll see more artisanal workers working. I've seen in some places 1,000 on more than one occasion. The lower grade ore bodies tend not to be as attractive because, you know, because of the degree of manual labour involved. Below a certain grade, it just becomes not viable for them. Next, please, Christina. So there's a whole range of commodities that can be mined artisanally. So this is just a list I put together, you know, a brain dump that I did, and of the ones that I'm aware of and that I've seen. You know, I know of obviously gold, silver, the tin, tantalum, and tungsten, you know, in places such as the DRC, copper, cobalt, again in the DRC, coal, oil, gems, diamonds, mica, sand, clay, stone, salt, sulfur, coral, mercury, rare earths, amber, and even mammoth tusk. You know, there's so many different things that are mined by artisanal miners around the world, and it's quite incredible. ASM is also a big contributor to the global production of various commodities. So, you know, the number that's typically bandied around into the global sapphire supply, 26% in terms of the 3Ts, and about 20% in terms of the rare earth side of things. And obviously China is the major producer of rare earths, and getting accurate numbers out of China is very, very difficult. About 7 million artisanal miners in China. There's about 40 million artisanal miners globally directly employed. And then if you factor in the indirect employees in the artisanal space, it's another 240 million people. So in total, it's about 280 million people worldwide that are employed directly and indirectly by artisanal mining, so of the world's population, and it's between 10 and 12% of the employment workforce in the third world. So it's really significant. Next, please, Christina. One of the interesting things about ASM, artisanal mining, is that once countries get to a certain GDP per capita, artisanal mining tends to get phased out. And that's because as the wealth of the country increases, it enables people to purchase machines. When people can purchase machines, machines can do it more efficiently than what artisanal miners can do. And so artisanal mining gets phased out. An interesting sort of quirk about artisanal mining that most people wouldn't know is that artisanal mining also exists in the richer countries. So the countries I know of, Australia, Canada, the United States, Russia, but it's typically those people that either have a thirst for certain commodities. And so we in Australia here, we have large artisanal mining areas in Lightning Ridge and Coober Pedy in the opal space. What's interesting in Russia, independent prospecting for gold was outlawed by Stalin back in 1954. And I did a lot of work trying to find artisanal miners in Russia. I was told virtually everywhere that I went that artisanal miners didn't exist in Russia. But I was certain that they did. And on the third trip to Russia, I managed to find some. This is a guy I spent a couple of nights with in the Russian Far East. Next, please. So this is, and what you'll see that the presentation will jump around a little bit, and that's mainly because I want to give people a sense for the diversity of artisanal mining. This is an artisanal sulfur miner working in an active volcano in Indonesia. So at this time, highest level of alert, and on the basis an eruption was imminent. So to give a sense to that, the White Island, this was on a higher
Hugh, I'm going to interrupt just
level
for
of
1
alert than the White Island
second.
volcano, which erupted in New Zealand, I think, in the last 12 or 18 months. So.
Yeah, I'm going to interrupt you just for 1 second. We're considering, if you wouldn't mind turning off your video, it might limit the cutting in and out of your voice. And since we're looking at your images,
Okay.
let's give it a try, okay?
All right, sure.
Thanks. We can turn it off on your behalf.
Yeah, can you do that for me, please, Christine?
Yep. Okay, your video's off and we can keep going.
Okay. So this is an artisanal sulfur mine. The volcano was on a higher level of alert than what the White Island volcano was in New Zealand 12 to 18 months ago. Next, please, Christina. So these guys were, what was interesting about these guys were that they'd go down into the bowels of the volcano, they would chisel out a quantity of sulfur, and then they'd haul that 4 kilometers up and out of the volcano to a weigh station. The average load carried by these guys was about 70 kilograms. So, this guy would have weighed about 55 kilograms. So he was carrying more than his body weight up and out of the volcano. It was quite incredible. And for every, they got paid on the per kilogram. So for every kilogram they carried out, they got paid 6.6 US cents. Next slide, please, Christina. This was and as part of with the project that I've been doing, what I've been trying to do is get a diversity of commodity, a diversity of topography, a diversity of geography, and a diversity of culture. So I wanted to capture some of the highest altitude miners in the world. These guys here were working at an altitude of about just over 15,000 feet. I'm aware of higher mining locations in the Andes, but there is a bit of a ceiling in terms of how high these guys can mine, because beyond a certain height, water remains frozen all the time, so they can't get sort of water for basic sustenance, and also to drive sort of some machinery that they have. Next slide, please, Christina. These guys were working in the on the Bolivian Altiplano in Bolivia. They were working in probably one of the most dangerous places I've ever been, a mountain called Cerro Rico. It's estimated that between 4 and 8 million people have died since mining began there back in 1545. These guys were hauling out manually in these wagons about 2.5 tons of ore to be sort of sorted and graded once they got it outside the mountain. What made Cerro Rico so dangerous, they're mining for silver and tin, was that because mining had been going on for so long, since 1545, there were all these unmapped voids inside the mountain. So the mountain was literally collapsing in on itself. And I think while I was there was between 3 and 5 people per month dying. So if you can imagine a piece of Swiss cheese, that's what was happening with Cerro Rico. When mining started there in 1545, the height of Cerro Rico was, I think, 4,832 meters. When I got there, it had shrunk to about 4,790 meters. Next slide, please, Christina. So this guy was deep inside Cerro Rico. He was what was called a percussion driller. So to give some context to him, the percussion drillers went where they couldn't get machinery. So when I'm talking machinery, I'm talking things like an air leg, which is used to drill holes for blasting and the like. So his job deep inside the mountain was to knock out between 2 and 4 30-centimeter holes in an 8-hour shift with a hammer and a chisel. Cerro Rico was at altitude, so these guys were mining at about, he would have been mining at about 14,500 feet. You can see in his left cheek, it's all puffed out. That's coca leaf that he's chomping on. The miners believe that coca leaf gave them, helped alleviate fatigue. It helped alleviate the deficiencies of limited oxygen, and it helped alleviate hunger. So at this altitude, these guys were working using about 50% of the oxygen that you would otherwise get at sea level. So it's quite extraordinary. Next slides, please, Christina. This was a guy in West Africa, a place called Yako. There was about, in Burkina Faso, there was about 10,000 miners in that one spot. These guys were mining for gold. And as you can see, if you look front left of frame, you can see a typical shaft. Some of those shafts will go down 30, 40, 50 meters or so. I've been down some shafts over there. I think the first one I went down was about 32 meters. And how they get down is they chisel a hole in each side of the shaft, and they crab walk down. So it's quite dangerous. If you fall, you've got problems, but you don't hear of too many people falling. Next slide, please, Christina. This is, it was in Myanmar, and artisanal oil is not something that's widely known about, I suppose, by most people that have heard of artisanal mining. It had two things going on in this oil field. It was a huge oil field. It was all done manually. So the actual oil extraction was done using derricks and very primitive gensets with cabling, and that drop the reservoir down the hole, and then put women and men that moved around the oil field, basically scooping up oil that had been spilt with their bare hands and with rags. And what they were doing was they were squeezing the oil into buckets that they carried with them, and then they took it back and they filled back to their camps. They filtered it out and they sold it to trucks sort of moving the oil. It was a black market oil field. So officially the oil field didn't exist, but in every other respect, the oil field existed. And what made that you know, what makes that interesting was that it was illegal, but it was being done with the sanction of the Burmese government. So a really sort of incredible place. Next slide, please. This was in Burkina Faso again. This young kid was taking, you know, fuel around for compressors and gensets and all of that sort of stuff. Children in artisanal mining locations is obviously a sensitive subject. I've got pretty strong views on it. It's very, very nuanced, again, as most things are within this space. And basically, kids in Africa very often and very commonly are the superannuation for their parents. So it's not uncommon to hear of families with 9 kids and all of that sort of stuff. And one of the major reasons the parents do that is it's so that they have younger family members to support them as they get older. Next slide, please. Some of the artisanal mining locations around the world that I've been involved with or will be going to through South America, you've got, you know, Colombia, Bolivia, you've got artisanal gold through Peru in places such as Madre de Dios, which is, you know, gets a lot of publicity. You've got artisanal mining in Mexico. And then through Africa, it's pretty much everywhere in Africa. I'm not aware of any country that hasn't got some form of artisanal mining in Africa. And then you've got extensive artisanal mining also through Southeast Asia, Central Asia, countries such as India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and then even up in places such as the Russian Far East, which extract, you know, mammoth tusk, but also gold. Next slide, please. And then the next slide also. So characteristics of artisanal mining places, I suppose the first thing that gets you when you go into these places, they're just amazing hives of activity. There's so much going on everywhere you look. And as a photographer, one of the greatest challenges is to isolate subject matter within such busy locations. So here, this is in Burkina Faso, in a place in northwestern Burkina Faso, up near the border with Mali. It was difficult when I was there, but it would not be safe to go there now. Another thing about artisanal mining communities is they tend to be very, very mobile. So when I visited on this occasion, there were about 50,000 people working in this gold field. I went back 3 to 4 months later, and that number had shrunk to between probably 200 and 400. So if the ore body gets depleted or other factors cut in, then the miners will just drop everything or not drop everything. They'll pick up all their belongings and go somewhere else. You see a lot of Hessian in artisanal mining locations. You know, you can see rudimentary structures holding, you know, that they used to provide themselves with shelters. Next slide, please, Christina. Another thing about artisanal mining locations is that the economies within can be quite complex, and both between locations within countries, they can be nuanced between countries, and then they can be nuanced, you know, between continents as well. So it's there's no one model for artisanal mining. So I get really annoyed when I hear people come out and say artisanal miners are all terrorists, or artisanal miners, it's all about child labor, or there's all these human rights abuses going on. It's in artisanal mining because basically these people, when they find that there's minerals in any given place, they go there and then they work out how to extract those minerals. So they all come up with their own models for extraction, and then they come up with, you know, their own economic models to share the spoils. One of the things I like about artisanal mining is that you tend to see the wealth generated by artisanal mining staying within local communities. That's very different to large scale mining. So, and typically international mining companies, you know, go into countries where there's artisanal mining, and what happens is that most of the wealth that's generated by those large scale mining companies ends up going out of the country. So the other thing too is the employment benefit. With large scale mining, when large scale mines go into these countries, they tend to like skilled labor. So automatically you wipe out a large section of a population that would be attracted to artisanal mining. Artisanal mining also provides a mechanism for the miners themselves to upskill, so to gain skills that they wouldn't get otherwise, just because they're too poor to get themselves educated and the like. This was in India. This is an underground coal mine in India, an illegal underground coal mine. What was interesting about this was that one of the guys in the village was a mining engineer, so he told them where to put the pillars, and so it felt quite safe. Were called Biharis, and the old using picks and shovels at the coalface, and then the Biharis, these guys would come in and collect it. They would take it to the top. The women would then buy it off the Biharis, and the women would coke the coal, and then the cycle wallers would then come and take the coal, buy the coal off the ladies who'd done the coking, and then transport it to the village, which could be, up to 72 kilometres away. And to give you an idea, some of those cycle wallers were carrying up between 250 and 450 kilos on a single bicycle. It was quite extraordinary. Next slide, please, Christina. This was a different style of inverted commas mining. These women basically were working in a large scale coal mine. When the machinery finished work at the end of night shift, and in between night shift and day shift starting, these women and some men would get working. They'd stockpile it on the edge of the mine, and then when the machine started up, they were carried out of the mine. What was different about India to other places that I've worked in was that in other places I've worked in, pretty much all the miners that I came across made the active choice to work as artisanal miners. And the main reason for that was because they could earn 3 times as much as what they would earn if they were in the villages or out in the fields of the farms. In India, what had happened, the Adivasi, these women and men form part of India's indigenous people, and they are recognised explicitly within the Indian constitution. But the problem was that coal was one of 5 strategic minerals within India. And so coal seemed to take priority over the rights of the Adivasi in the Indian constitution. So these people had been forced, and what was happening, so was coal was coming along and literally gobbling up the countryside. And most of the time they were getting little to nothing for the loss of their land. So in a way, what had happened was these people had to turn to the very mineral that had brought about their destruction. So it was quite sad. And these people were a little uncomfortable with me being there because they were worried that that was going to lead to sort of publicity and therefore them getting, in trouble with the law, which was just garbage, basically. Next slide, please, Christina. Back to northern Pakistan, a couple of gem miners. In this location, there were about 600 miners working, and they worked in cooperatives of about 7 each. So, and each of those 7 brought different things to the table. Of those 7, 1 was a cook. So every hut there, and there's about 100 huts, had their own cook. Next slide, please, Christina. Again, you can see northern Pakistan. One of the challenges of working at 15,000 feet. Basically, everything had to be brought up from the valley below, which was a 2,000 meter vertical elevation gain to just get to work at Chima Bakor. the mountain behind was the Mountain Diran, is about 7,027 meters, and just over to the right of frame, you can't see it, there was one of the highest mountains in the world, Rakaposhi. But basically everything came up on donkeys, and I'm not sure if I've got a slide here with, even things, goats were walked up manually from the village. These guys worked a 3-month mining season between 15 July and 15 October. And the main reason for that was the snow. When the snow started to come in, it became too dangerous, the sort of stuff. So, and likewise, they had to wait until the snow melt through mid-July. Christine, are you getting good? Are you getting good sound there or not?
It comes and goes. We have stretches where you sound great, and then we have stretches where it cuts out. But I think the consensus is let's just keep going.
You sure?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Everyone's nodding.
All right. Next slide, please.
There's one hand raised. We could take a moment. Sharon, if you want to unmute.
Nope, sorry, that was a mistake.
Oh, sorry.
I hit a wrong
Okay.
button. Yeah.
We are taking questions, so feel free to note them in the chat and we'll get back to them. Okay, I'll remute. Bye.
Okay, so this is back in the Ijen volcano in Indonesia. There were it's hard to know how many people are wondered. These guys got paid 6 points sulfur. They got carried up and out of the volcano. There would have been a lot of deaths there, but they hadn't. And typically what I find with these guys, their risk profile tends to be a lot higher, but because their risk profile is higher, their awareness of the risks and their management of the risks tends to be a lot better. So there'd been, I think it was difficult to get an accurate sense, but I think in the 50 years, there'd been about 6 deaths. Next slide, please. This guy worked deep inside Cerro Rico back in Bolivia, the silver miner. His job was to grade the ore. He was deep inside the mountain, and this is a particularly dangerous location. These guys worked hard and they were seriously tough. What was also interesting about Cerro Rico was that outside the mountain, they worshipped God. When they entered the mountain, they worshipped the devil. So inside the mountain, they would take offerings. Each mine had an effigy of El Tío, which was the devil. And they would take offerings to El Tío and they'd give him, offerings of alcohol or offerings of tobacco or whatever else, coca leaf. And they believed that by respecting El Tío would help them find high-grade ore bodies and he would keep them safe from some of the hazards inside that mountain. Next slide, please, Christina. So some of the myths about artisanal mining and their work. All miners die when they hit 50. All artisanal mines are hotbeds for conflict minerals, terrorism, organised crime and human trafficking. That's a myth. All artisanal mining workers and children are ruthlessly being exploited. That's a myth. The environmental footprint for artisanal mining is much worse than that for large-scale mining. So just on that point, it's an important point because I've had extensive experience in both. I mean, I've probably had even more experience in that the large scale mining footprint is not necessarily any better than what the artisanal mining footprint is. So when we're thinking about responsible sourcing, and just because a mine is a commodity is mined by a large scale mine in a Western country, whether that be Australia or Canada or the US or elsewhere, that does not mean that it's, you know, the environmental footprint is any less than what it is for artisanal mining. Another sort of myth is there's a death every 10 minutes. They're all hotbeds for human trafficking. All artisanal mining is illegal and therefore must be stopped. Just on that point, what's important about that is that this whole concept of illegality is nuanced. So even in Western countries, we have nuances around illegality, because you can have laws on the statute books that have been there for 150 to changing those laws. So technically, everyone is breaking those laws, but it's not enforced. I mean, do we consider that to be illegal? I mean, that'd be a hard stretch. And so it is in sort of artisanal mining. You've got these grades and nuance. And I've worked in places that are so-called illegal, but there's been government officials and police officers stationed there by the state to help keep law and order. So the state knows that implicitly by not sort of charging anyone for mining there. Artisanal mining doesn't benefit the state. Large scale mining does. Look, that's a really, that's an interesting one that I have a particular view on as well. I mean, large scale mining here in Australia, we've got the largest mining companies in the world. They've all got Singapore marketing hubs, and those Singapore marketing hubs are there to enable transfer pricing of higher taxing jurisdictions. The other thing too is, here in my home state, you've got, at the moment in the one commodity I'm thinking of, you've got companies that are, their cost of production are $20 a ton, and they're selling that same commodity for 160 to 180 US dollars a ton, and they're paying minimal royalties in the context of the money they're currently making. So, I look at artisanal mining and say, well, there's huge employment. You're looking at, as I said, 280 million people around the world, directly and indirectly. If you're just looking at directly, it's about 40 million. And then you measure that against large scale mining around the world, there's only 7 million people in large scale mining employed directly. So artisanal mining, for all its challenges, and I'm not dismissing those challenges, but there's a lot of good that comes out of it as well. Next slide, please. So that leads into what I've just sort of been talking about. The importance as an economic driver. If we could go to the next slide, please. Basically, with so many people employed in artisanal mining, if we stop buying from them, automatically we're making nearly 4%, 3.6% of the world's population worse off. And what we have to think about is that if we decide to stop sourcing from
For some reason, Hugh's really cutting out right now. He's still on the call. He hasn't. Oh, you're back. You're back. Maybe.
Wait.
Hugh, if you can hear me, let me know. Can you hear me? Ooh, I think he just dropped off entirely. I don't see him on the.
Okay. Little
Here we go.
technical. There we go.
Yeah, I'm back on, Maggie.
Okay, good.
Great.
Okay, thanks.
This is a bit trickier than we'd envisaged. Okay, so next slide, please. So these guys working sort of in the active volcano, every miner that I asked every miner that I asked was doing it because it paid better than all the other options available. So and their whole reason for being there was that we have a lot of fly in, fly out miners, and most of those people, they don't love their work, but they do it because they get paid better, and that enables them to buy a better house or a bigger car and to put their kids through better schooling. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So this was Burkina Faso. So you can see this was a mine where there was about 10,000 people working. Again, you know, you come back to the complex economies of these places, and everyone's got a different role to play. Women typically, I don't think I've ever seen women doing the mining itself, unless it's sort of processing alluvial gravels in rivers and the like. But they do a lot of the processing work in artisanal mining locations. And in this location in Guinea in West Africa, there was something a bit like, when we got there in the morning, and there was something like there was only 3 of us there, and that was myself, my fixer, and there was a security guard there with a rifle on his shoulder. Within 3 to 4 hours, that same goldfield had gone from 3 people to about 10,000 people. And at this time, working there. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So here you can see that was the same goldfield. One back, if we could, please, Christina. So you can see here, when we got there, there was 3 of us in that goldfield, and then within 3 or 4 hours, there were about 10,000 people. And, you know, you even things such as prostitution, pretty much any occupation you can think of in the West, to some extent, you'll find in these artisanal mining locations, just at a different level. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And here it's just, you know, the same deal. Okay, so this was in Burma again. You can see the women hauling, you know, buckets of oil that they've scraped up with, literally with their bare hands. They squeeze it in, they take the buckets, as I said earlier, back to their camps and process it. Myanmar was probably one of the most, if not the most difficult country I think I've ever worked in. The surveillance of the state was off the charts. In fact, in the middle of that frame, you can see a guy on a motorbike riding the other way. I'm pretty sure it was like 20 to 25 undercover police, and most of those guys were keeping an eye on me when I was there. Next slide, please.
Can you restate what you were just saying about the difficulty, that it was one of the most difficult places, because you cut out momentarily and it sounded important?
Yeah, look, Myanmar, Christina, was one of the most difficult countries that I've worked in. The surveillance from the state was just off the charts, and it was, yeah, I remember working in that particular oil field, and there was 1 or 2 days in there that I sort of had a sense that there was a rifle scope on me, and you know, there was, but conducted with the sanction of the Burmese government. So what you had was, you had the oil barons in field that the Chinese were sort of had a large scale lease on that. So when the state, and there was a lot of distrust from you know, the oil barons in Yangon. I remember at one stage I was photographing the hundreds of trucks coming and going from that oil field. I'm talking tankers. And all of a sudden a phone call came through to my fixer and we were told to get the hell out of there because we were photographing trucks that officially didn't exist and we couldn't show that they existed, if that made sense. Next slide, please. Okay, this is an interesting one as well. These guys were mining sand in the Wiry River Estuary in Cameroon in West Africa. Basically, their job was to dive for sand and then load it onto these canoes. You can see one in the background there. And each diver would dive, they would bring up about 1.7 tons of sand in a 3.5 hour shift. And they would dive between 1 and 7 meters around the low tide to bring that sand up. And so the sand was being used in essentially in the building and construction. About 12 to 18 months after, a dredge came in from a neighbouring country and basically put 1,500 artisanal miners out of work. So these guys you're looking at there, Simon included, they were put out of work and had to go and find something else to do. So this is the challenge with machinery. When mechanization comes in, next slide, please. Next slide, please. So again, it comes back, you know, the question I often get asked, why do these people risk their lives? That's the question I get asked, to do what they do. And these people do what they do is to make better lives for themselves and for their families. So that means to provide a better house for their spouses and for their children. They're essentially sacrificing the lives they could be living now for the, inverted commas, prospect of a better life. So and in that respect, really all of us are miners at heart, because every single one of us, I can imagine on this call, we're sacrificing aspects of ourselves to provide for others. And that's exactly what these miners do, and that's exactly why they do it. It's just that they're doing that in the context of the third world, we're doing it in the context of the developed world. And what's also interesting, you know, when we I'll talk about that in a minute. Next slide, please, Christina. So yeah, like people, when they're under pressure and they're, you know, I don't think it, as I said, it's a trait that's unique to the developing the third world. It's something that all of us have that characteristic as well. So, you know, when you're working in these situations, these guys, what was also interesting was that these guys took a lot of pride in what they did. So some of them were celebrities or sort of known around the world because they've been doing it for a long time. And they took huge pride and satisfaction that what they were doing, what they were doing was valued. And I think, and that was pretty awesome. And I tried to conduct some interviews after working in that volcano, and the answers were sort of muted in terms of, you know, would they rather be doing or not? But my experience when I was in there was that they wanted to be in there because they were providing better lives for self and family. Next slide, please. Next slide, please, Christina. So this guy, Papa Auguste, he'd been working in that mine since it opened in 1968. Next, go back one. Go back one if you could, Christina. All right. I'll talk. The previous slide showed one of the sulfur miners who'd been working there since 1968. Now the one after that, yeah.
Are you looking for the family or the
That's
individual?
the one, yeah, that's it.
Okay.
Yeah, great. So Papa Auguste had been working in that sulfur mine since 1968, when the sulfur mine began. And I remember asking him, I said, what's your goal? And he said he would stop when he had 5 cows, because cows obviously in Indonesia are sort of the store of value for these sorts of people. When I spoke to him last year, he'd only reached 2 cows and he was still going in the volcano, but he was slowing down. Papa Auguste would be 70, 72, one of the just huge pride. Just an amazing human being, sulfur miners. Next slide, please, Christina. So the next slide was in northern Pakistan, a guy called Muhammad, and Muhammad had been working in the gem fields. This guy here had been working in the gem fields since 1988. He again, a lot of these what was interesting about these gem miners was that about a third of them made really good money from the gem mines each season, because they didn't have advanced tools to find the gem nests, but about a third of them did quite well, and they'd managed to sort of invest in property and in other towns or places within Gilgit-Baltistan. Was the village that had oversight of these gem fields extracted a royalty as well that went into a health fund and provided for education, all that sort of stuff. So that was a really good example where the gem fields were doing good things for not only the miners but for people in the village. Next slide, please. So these guys were, typical of the gem miners working at Chimabukor. They were typical of the 600 or so gem miners working at Chimabukor. Spectacular location. They're all of Islamic faith, so they prayed to Mecca 5 times a day in between sort of mining for gems. One of the challenges, I suppose, there was that some of the safety things you would, not normally do in larger scale mining, they sort of tended to cut corners a bit, and that was lazy but getting overconfident with what they were doing. I was actually nearly killed in a blast there, because there was probably between 100 and 200 blasts per day going on inside the mines, and at one stage they didn't warn of the blast properly, and a bit of fly rock went past my nose at about 200 kilometers an hour, about a meter in front of my face. So another sort of weakness in that mining area was that the spacing between the mines had gotten to be too limited at times. So I think it was supposed to be a minimum of 3 feet or 9 feet, and there were certain mines getting down to 18-inch spacing between neighbouring mines. And where that became problematic was when people were working inside one mine and then another mine next door set off some explosives, and that happened numerous times when I was inside. The whole mine would literally shake. Next slide, please. So this is Muhammad. This was his family. Great people. This was typical of the type of house and village that these people lived in the mining area that I was working in. In the Karakoram. Next slide, please. And again, even in Bolivia, it was the same deal. Like I found it harder to get closer to the miners in Bolivia. They were just hard nuts. They were tough, but they were all, you know, when you sat down with them, and they were all saying, look, they wouldn't want their kids to be doing what they were doing because it was too dangerous inside the mountain, but they wanted to get, they wanted their kids and their families to get ahead, and that's why they were there. Next slide, please. Um, Again, this guy, you know, these guys, I said to this guy just before I took this photo, I pointed to a bit of overhanging rock above him and above us, and said that looked pretty dangerous. And he said, it's okay, LTO will look after us. And that was the devil. So he put all his trust in LTO looking after him. Next slide, please. And I suppose this summarizes what artisanal miners are all about, in my experience. Loosely translated, that says, here lie the men that gave their lungs in the deep mine shafts for the betterment of mankind. And I reckon if you had to find us, you know, a summary of why artisanal miners are doing that around the world, then that's been what I've seen around the world. Next slide, please. So just to summarize, most miners I've met, they choose their work to get ahead. It's mostly or generally not of a necessity. It happens because they can make more money than what they would otherwise make in the fields and the farms. They're sacrificing the lives they could be living now for the prospect of better lives. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. So why does any of this matter? Many of them will be over sort of the changes that have been going on, but basically there's a few things have come together. There's this conscientious consumerism movement's come together. There's been legislative change through Dodd-Frank, the OECD and EU. There's been activist NGO groups pushing for change. You know, and that conscientious
We lost your sound again, but we're reading the bullet points. I'm sure the fourth one is catching people's attention. I'll go to the next slide in hopes that your sound will come back.
Oh, it looks like.
Yeah, we're back again. Okay, can you hear me, Christina?
We can, and we've moved on to the slide in 2010, the Obama administration slide, if you want to.
Yeah, so the 2010 Obama administration enacted US SEC listed companies to basically check their supply chains for the three tintalum and tungstens, and to see if they might originate from the DRC or their neighbours. It wasn't just focused on importers, it could be retailers as well. You just had to be SEC listed. And then you're required to report yearly on what steps they'd taken to address any of the risks that they weren't contributing to the funding of armed groups or human rights abuses. Next slide, please. The OECD followed after that. And as we know, there's 37 member countries of the OECD or thereabouts. They've listed 10 conflict and high risk areas in their guidelines. And their guidelines apply to entities sourcing from or operating in conflict and high risk areas. and seek to take in things that take in torture, cruelty, inhumane and degrading forms of child labour, gross human rights violations and abuses, and then war crimes and crimes against humanity, etc. And then next slide, please. And then on the 1st of January 2021, after a long gestation, from what I understand, the EU conflict minerals regulation came into force. It draws largely from the OECD guidelines, but applies only to the three tantalum and tungsten and gold. It applies to countries considered to be conflict affected or high risk, not just the ones named in the OECD guidelines. It applies to the importers of minerals rather than to the end product companies. And I'm sure there'll be people that are more over this than what I am. It essentially requires EU companies to ensure they import the three TG. These are most often linked to conflicts and human rights abuses. Although there's, I believe that it'll indirectly affect some 500 smelters and refiners, whether based in the EU or not. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. In the EU requirements, there's different requirements for upstream and downstream companies. The upstream companies have to comply. Oops. Going back. So the momentum from all of this okay. So in the EU requirements, there's different requirements for upstream and downstream companies. The upstream companies have to comply with mandatory due diligence when they report, because this is thought to be the most risky part of the supply chain. Companies, those importing metal stage products, and then those operating beyond the metal stage that don't
How about this? With the hope that Hugh will be back to just finish out our session with being able to answer some of your questions. I'm just going to slide through these really briefly so that you can see, and if Hugh, you can hear me, I'm just going through your slides and allowing people a moment with the talking points that you've prepared.
Okay, so
we're just kind of going through here. Maggie, would you mind turning on your mic as well?
Sure.
And I think right now, just since we can't hear Hugh, one of the questions is whether or not we'll share the slides afterwards. And that's something that we have to finalize permission from Hugh. They will be in the recording, which is why I'm kind of pausing on each one to make sure that they're there. Some of the questions that came in advance, I don't know if Hugh will be available to hear us, had to do with the role of the documentary photographer and the point of view of someone from the outside documenting a community. potentially being different from the miners themselves or the community members themselves holding the camera and doing their own photos. And so we were curious, how Hugh would speak to that role, and, what his hopes are with the book that he's producing in terms of how people will take on the information that they see visually. What's the takeaway by sharing these beautiful and at times harsh images in the form of a consumable book? So I don't know if we can hear him at all. I'm going to pause to see if Hugh is hearing me.
Yeah, I can hear you, Christina.
Great. Do you mind speaking to that?
Can you hear?
We can hear you.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so to sort of catch up from where you guys are, abandoning artisanal mining is not the answer. And that comes back to what I was saying through before. If we stop sourcing from them because we're worried about our exposure to less salient aspects of what they do, we need to think of the implications for what they do. So, 280 million of the world's poorest people suddenly become disenfranchised. What do they do? Where do they go? How do they put food on the table? Where do they live? And then what do we do for the social fabric of the societies that
Hugh, the audio is still cutting out, unfortunately. Sorry, everyone. We didn't anticipate these technical challenges, but we're managing best we can. We also had a little bit of a later start, so we are planning to wrap up at 9:30. I'm sorry, or 12:30, depending on your time zone. If you're able to stay on a little longer and you'd like to, you're welcome to. But maybe we could take a look at some of the questions and points of conversation that we've been seeing in the chat. And so, we have our artisanal mining expert, Christina Villegas here, is asking about negotiating access. Oh, we have Hugh. Hugh, can you hear us? Okay. Christina Villegas, do you maybe want to come on for a moment and just ask your question and maybe speak a little bit to how accessing ASM sites, like some of the considerations there and maybe some examples you've seen. Maybe if Hugh's audio is working, we can get back to him in a moment.
Yeah, I was just curious what Hugh's protocols are for meeting these communities who are usually very far flung. In most parts of the world, you have to have like a warm introduction. You don't want to just walk up, of course, and introduce yourself. They have no idea who you are. So one thing that PAC does is that if we know there's another NGO working in the area, we'll ask for an introduction or suggestions for people to meet. Or we'll ask the local ASM association that we might know for the introduction, explain the purpose of the research or the project, and then ask for permission and have a very structured introduction process. Otherwise, a lot of these sites are armed. So you have to be really careful for security purposes. So I was just curious what Hugh's process is for meeting these folks, and if he goes back.
Yeah.
Mm.
One thing that we've been doing recently is whenever we take pictures, we try to actually go back and give it to the miners. And people, it's like really unexpected. And so actually, one thing I purchased during the pandemic was a little like instant, like
Polaroid?
printer. Yeah, Polaroid
Oh,
one. Just so if I'm not sure, I'll go back, and at least they have something. But the Moyo ladies, of course, we've been taking a lot of pictures of them. And the first time I went back, we gave them copies, and they had never happened to them before. And we've since taken a lot more pictures, but I'm waiting. I have them printed. I'm waiting to go back because I promised that to them. So when you make promises, you have to deliver, or else the next person who comes, people are skeptical.
Thanks. Hugh, we see you joined back. We're going to be wrapping up our session here, but just want to check in with you if you have any. I think Christina's question at the end, that what may have been missed, is kind of your key message or takeaways in sharing these images, and how would you like people to use this information that you're sharing through these documentary images?
Look, I would like people to think about, when we hear about the stereotypes and, the running down of the artisanal mining industry, it's got all these bad aspects. I'd like people to think about some of the good aspects as well. And I'd like people to think that when we're trying to do the right thing, what does the right thing actually look like? Does that look like abandoning these people and just cutting them off at the knees, or does it look like something else? Because if we think that we can buy, if something is considered to be responsibly sourced because it doesn't incorporate, human rights or human child labor or whatever else, because we bought it from a large scale mining company, is that really doing anything for the greater good? Because artisanal mining generates a lot of employment, and it puts a lot of meals on tables and stuff like that. So I would like to see the larger companies working with artisanal miners to improve things rather than simply abandoning them and just leaving them to fend for themselves. I think that's really, really important.
Yeah, thank you, Hugh. We as a group of members of the jewelry industry who are concerned about responsible sourcing are often talking about artisanal and small scale mining because of the huge role that it plays in helping us to access the materials that we use, but also because we wouldn't be able to do what we do without artisanal miners. And one thing that has surfaced as a truth over and over again is that the way that we can really respect artisanal miners and create equitable, beneficial supply chains is to keep engaging and value artisanal miners as equal stakeholders and equal business partners in this work, and work with them to keep improving practices. And we're just kind of at the beginning of that, but I think that consciousness is becoming more of a solidified in the industry. Christina, do you want to add anything to close us out, or spend a few minutes on questions? Where'd you like to go next?
Well, if someone has a question that they'd really like to ask, let's take a question. It seems like folks really enjoy just being exposed to your work and being exposed to these different sites.
Christina Mall has a question.
Sure.
Thank you so
Christina.
much. Unforgettable. I realize it's impossible to generalize, but I'm wondering, Hugh, if you ever saw, let's say, gold miners, for example, artisanal gold miners negotiating prices on their own behalf, or are they completely at the mercy of dealers who come to them to and kind of set the prices on their behalf?
Look, it's a complex question, Christina. I've to a large extent, you know, when you're selling gold, you're a price taker rather than a price maker. And so, you know, what then sort of needs to sort of be factored in is who else up the food chain needs to take their cut as well. So you've got all of those things cutting in. One of the unfortunate aspects of artisanal mining at the moment is that you've got armed groups or not armed groups so much, but sort of a lot of banditry going on between the artisanal mines and their home, for example. So miners will leave the gold fields, and on the way they'll get hit by bandits, sort of because there's obviously no security and stuff like that. So that's another challenge that feeds into that. Could you hear me properly then?
Yes, thank you.
That's great.
Gold is one of those, the price of gold is pretty much, it's not everywhere it's known, but it's pretty widely known because you can just Google price of gold and it's set every day. In general, miners make about 80% of the gold price. If it's in a place where they're competing, where you have like mafia groups who want to launder money, they might get a higher price because gold, you could just say, oh, I run a gold mine, and then here's the reason for all this cash. But yeah, as Hugh said, you know, there's always people in the food chain, and so you might have to compensate, you know, of that money, you might have to compensate the financier who's paying for the labor, the food, the rice, the landowner, local government bureaucrat who is demanding a bribe. So it's often divided, even if they have the higher price that they negotiate.
Thanks, Christina. We have one real practical question, and you know, in the realm of photography and in the digital age, it's really easy to take images and share them readily across the web, and this is Hugh's livelihood. So Hugh, if you wouldn't mind kind of explaining to us how we can best share your work that honors your work and helps you kind of promote the images and your projects without damaging any potential opportunities that you have therein. So do you have some guidelines for how you would like people to be able to share your images?
Certainly people can see, you can share my work through LinkedIn, my LinkedIn page. And then also they can access it through, you know, the website www.garamperosproject.com, or they can get in touch with me directly through my email, hb@garamperosproject.com. So, you know, in the social media forums, sharing images, I have no issue. It's more just, you know, I don't want people downloading images and then using them as their own, for example.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, that helps. And if you'd like, we can take one more question. Anna, why don't you just come on and ask?
Thanks. Yeah. Hi, Christina. Thank you, Hugh, so much for sharing all of this with us. I think the question that Christina just asked is kind of why I'm wondering about the context as well. So what I'm wondering is what considerations you keep in mind as you're putting this work out in the world to avoid the possibility of anything coming off as othering or, you know, from a Western perspective, if the images are not in the context that you want them to be presented in. You obviously have so much empathy and passion in sharing these really important stories. So I was kind of just wondering, like, yeah, do you feel that the best way for these images to be viewed is along with these stories, whether that's in a forum like this or in a book? Do you have any concerns or considerations around them being viewed in different contexts, whether it's other people sharing them or in a more gallery setting where the words of the story are not present with it? Does that make sense, kind of?
Yeah, no, the question is an easy one to answer, Anna. Thank you for the question. Look, at the end of the day, I can't control what people think when they see my images, and I think it's wrong to try. What I hope is that my images stimulate discussion, and just through that generation of discussion and debate, that drives a greater understanding and a greater awareness of some of the issues around artisanal mining. Because this thing is, as you probably know, this thing runs so deep, and it's impossible. I shouldn't try to control the messaging, but hopefully the images of themselves bring awareness to sort of a complex debate.
Okay, thank you.
So I think we're a little over our time, but it's because you all want to be here, which is a wonderful thing. But we do have to wrap it up. And so we will, in our takeaways that we do with every living room session, will be included a variety of ways to get in touch with Hugh if you didn't capture those at the end of his slideshow. So you can look for those, but it's easy to look him up. And I did just drop the garimpierosproject.com in the chat. If you want to click on that, that's a quick, easy way to follow him. And also we put the social media handles in earlier, but they're there. And so Maggie, I'm gonna hand it to you to do final last words. Oh, Anna.
We got a hand from Anna.
Few words to invite Hugh to come to Colombia. There's a huge activity in artisanal mining in Colombia, both legal and illegal. And I think it's very important to put it in the map and to raise awareness. So you're warmly invited, Hugh, whenever you want.
Thank you very much. I was actually offered a job in Colombia last year.
You should come. It's wonderful.
Great. I'm sure we'll have, it'd be cool to check in over time and stay updated on Hugh's travels and images that he's sharing. But I hope that through this session, you all are able to connect with him, go follow him on LinkedIn and Instagram. And it's really great to just get these peeks into artisanal mining around the world. Hugh, thank you so much for staying up late. It's past 12 where he is, and working with difficult conditions, and just sharing your experience and your images with all of us. We're all very grateful, and we'll be keeping an eye on you. For
Thanks,
everyone
Maggie.
else, yeah, thank you. Christina, I think we landed on, we'll be looking at doing our next living room session on September 17th. We're so glad to be back. And so keep an eye out in your email for our takeaways email, and we'll be staying in touch. Anything to add?
Thank you so much, Hugh.
Thank you very much, Christina.
It's been great having you. We look forward to keeping in touch.
Thank you.
All right, take
So
care.
good
Bye,
to see all your
everyone.
faces. All right.
See you guys.
Back to school time. See you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.